The Defense Department is going all in on supply chain resiliency because of the coronavirus pandemic. Some of that work includes managing the risks of industrial modernization in the defense industrial base. Eric Lofgren is research fellow at the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University and writing about this at the acquisitiontalk.com blog. Eric, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on the program. This is especially timely because of the possibility of a vaccine, as Pfizer has disclosed today. What is the main issue that you see in the resiliency of the supply chain as far as mobilizing against a black swan event?
Right, and I think the black swan event there is really the key issue, that we have these events that have outsized impacts but are very low probabilities, right? So with the pandemic, coronavirus, it's kind of like a once in 100-year type event, and the same might be said of armed conflict, right? That we could have wars. Most of these, wars that we've seen have been kind of small scale or proxy wars. And the threat that there could be a large war that requires its sustained mobilization is something that, of course, the military has been thinking about, but it's kind of on the horizon of, we need to think about industrial mobilization and make industrial mobilization cool again, such that the supply chains are resilient enough that they can ramp up. And when we're looking at coronavirus, right, like they're still having trouble ramping up production of N95 masks. And that's a relatively simple product, right? And when we think about and translate that over to the Department of Defense and what it might need to ramp up, it's a completely different ballgame.
Your inference at the end of this piece, it's time to make industrial mobilization cool again, infers that there was a time that it was cool in the past. I'm not sure I recall that, Eric, but indeed, if that does need to happen, you suggest two things that need to happen. The first thing you write about is the government needs to invest in the upstream production process. How and where should they make those investments, Eric?
Sure. Well, first, industrial mobilization was very cool after World War II and around the Korean War. And it wasn't until the 1960s that you started seeing a big drawdown in terms of critical material stockpiling and emphasis on, large capital and facility equipment that the government often owned, but the contractors would operate. And so one of the big things that we can talk about in terms of preparing for these black swan events, like a major war or a large pandemic, is funding that upstream production process. And that is something that the Department of Defense hasn't really been doing, because the tradition of the Department of Defense is to kind of, define a weapon system end item, right? And then fund that end item. And then the supply chain through the tiers, the prime contractor will be kind of like the lead system integrator and develop its teaming arrangements down the supplier tiers. And the department doesn't really have too much insight into that supplier base. And so one of the things that the department can do to make itself a little bit more resilient potentially is to disaggregate some of these systems, right? Take a little bit more control over the direction of subsystems and having families of prototypes of subsystems ready and different supplier bases. And funding the upstream production processes. So it's not just focusing on weapon systems end items. It's also enabling the tools that are necessary, like 3D printing or advanced manufacturing, right? And then artificial intelligence can go into that as well, reducing errors in advanced manufacturing. Blockchain's an important part of that. And there's several other types of things, and we've seen that with hypersonic vehicles, right? There was, in the 90s, the Air Force was asking for, hypersonic wind tunnels to do a lot more of these tests, and that's an enabling tool. And that kind of got shifted, and it wasn't as much of a priority. And now, 20, 30 years later, it becomes a big priority. And so funding the upstream production process through enabling tools will actually allow for more discovery, different types of ideas to arise. And it also builds in, excess capital such that you can surge and you're not just have this lean business efficiency where you have the minimum amount of capital required in order to service the end items that the department's asking for.
I will trust your study of history over my memory any day of the week, Eric, so touche to you. The second item that you suggest is that the government needs to adopt commercial practices. Same question, how and where?
Sure, yeah, so adopting commercial practices, of course, has been a huge issue over the past about 5 years, and even much further back, into the 90s and before. So one thing that the government can do is just continue doing things that it has been doing. Other transactions, we've seen a huge surge in other transactions for COVID-19. There's been over $10 billion for the vaccine through Operation Warp Speed. Of that, it seems like 7 to 9 billion potentially came through other transactions. But it's not just that. We have commercial solutions openings and a number of other types of ways that through the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, you can actually get a lot of things done pretty quickly. And one of the things about this is you can't, in terms of when you have an emergency come around, you can't just flip a switch, a cultural switch for the contracting community very easily and just say, okay, we focused on compliance, now we're focusing on speed. You almost have to say speed is kind of like our daily business and build that into the culture right up front, such that when you turn flip the switch and you're now in emergency mode, you're not worried like what we're going to be seeing probably over the next coming months and years in terms of, well, where did the money go? Was there waste, fraud, and abuse? Or just general confusion about what the policies were and not being able to take advantage of the authorities that the department actually did have.
Eric Lofgren, thanks very much for joining me. It's great to have you on.
You're welcome.